Hey guys, I'm Ted, here to give you another fast fact, another lecture, sorry about that. And this lecture is going to be part 2 of our analysis of the Populist Party / Populist Movement. Now, before we begin our lecture proper for today, I just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So, in our last lecture, we looked at the populist platform, the reform platform that very pointedly voiced the farmers' dissatisfaction with state legislators. They wanted to take away the power to appoint federal senators from the state legislators via the direct election of senators. They wanted to uh, really infringe upon the veto powers of state governors by calling for the referendum, which would allow them to have a veto-like oversight, would allow them to exercise this veto-like power and to have oversight of the state legislature's activities, of all the legislation that they attempted to pass, that they proposed. And of course, the initiative allowed the citizens themselves, the largely farming communities, of the Midwest and the South, to put forth legislative means on their own to sort of draft legislation or to present ideas on for legislators to be drafted on and submit that to the state. It allowed them to simply partake more directly in the legislative process. And of course, the recall. The recall was pointedly aimed at elected officials that the populists felt were corrupt and were in the pockets of the major monopolists. The recall, of course, provides for the immediate recall of an official, the end of before the end of that official's official political term in office. All right, and with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture for today, and we begin with the look at their attempt to form a lasting union with industrial laborers. They realized that they were but one small segment of the American population, and that the industrial laborer was of growing importance and becoming more dominant in this society. And they wanted to form a mutually beneficial pact or union with these industrial laborers. So they called for one, the abolition of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which largely functioned as a corporate mercenary army and was used to sort of suppress. It was used to sort of suppress the industrial laborers when they struck. And this was a part of their pitch to elicit the sympathy of the workers and to have the workers express sympathy for their plight. They also called for better working conditions for industrial workers, namely, this was something that the industrial laborers themselves had pushed for, but they pushed for an 8-hour workday for industrial laborers, and they also called for a limiting of immigration. Some called for a complete halt in immigration. Others called for restricting immigration to Northern Europeans, Scandinavians, Germans, and the British. Now, another main point, and this was a point that sort of drove a division between them and the industrial labor force, but they called for this Subtreasury Plan. And the Subtreasury Plan was a plan for grain storage. And it also called for the farmers to have the ability to borrow against that grain. The grain would be stored in federal warehouses. When the market price was really low, it would be stored in these federal warehouses for free. And then when the market prices rose again, it would be released onto the market so that the farmers made more money from their grain. This was a piece of legislation, a platform that the industrial laborers just could not support. Another one was that they really couldn't support was free silver, and free silver was a main platform, was the main crutch of the Populist Party. The free silver, that their main drawing point was with them advocating for the return of the minting of silver coin. silver coins at the ratio of 16 ounces to 1 ounce of gold. 16 ounces of silver for every 1 ounce of gold. Now, in the early republic, the government that printed money had to receive goods, gold or silver. But in 1873, the government abandoned this dual metallurgist policy in favor of gold. This became known by the Populists, as we stated before, as the crime of '73. The farmers wanted this policy because people who had silver would be encouraged to bring it in, and the government, of course, will begin printing paper money because it had silver. Now, this would cause the deflation then in effect to change to an inflation, enabling the farmers to pay off their debts more fast. Now, this was not a new idea. The old Greenback Party of the 1870s had called for this. The inflation argument is still being fought today by special interest groups. Pro-silver groups are still at it, trying to get silver put back on for circulation and distribution. And of course, this free silver had the free silver policy had a lot of opponents. Many of the economic leaders argued that this was simply unsound economics and it would lead to the ruin of millions, if not the republic as a whole. Congress twice agreed in 1878, though, with the Bland-Allison Act, and in 1890 with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act to a limited silver policy. Now, this did not cut it for the Populists, and it should be noted that these were legislatures controlled by the major parties who were trying to stem the appeal of the Populists. But those two acts, those two congressional acts, did not cut it for the Populists. They did not want limited silver. They wanted free, total, and unabated silver policy. They wanted that 16-to-1 ratio. They were adamant about that. They wanted there to be more money and paper money in circulation because they wanted that inflationary atmosphere so they can pay off their debts. Now, this would be their most popular plank. But their stated aim remained to unite all the workers in the republic regardless of race or section. In the Midwest, the Populists, of course, were deemed as the unkept social and intellectual backwaters of society, whose ineptitude would destroy the republic. In the South, a small minority of Populists attempted to unite both races in a class war against the conservative Democrat Redeemer. We discussed about them. Tom Watson was an early leader of that, but Tom Watson, after the failure of the party, would of course go rogue and become perhaps the greatest racist in the state of Georgia. It is a very disheartening tale, the transformation of Tom Watson after the election of 1896. Now, speaking of Watson, he was an early proponent of uniting the races, and that has to be stated. He wanted to improve the lot of all farmers. Watson, at this time, he even went so far, had to nominate an African American for executive office in Georgia, and he protected this man's home with armed white populists to deter the Redeemer racists from attacking this man's family and home. Now, conservative Democrats, of course, were thrown into a panic because the South was a one-party region. This is where they gained most of their congressional support. This is where they gained the overwhelming majority, I should say, of their congressional support in both the House and the Senate. They could not afford to see the South torn apart by two-party fighting. It was all well and good if they were able to do this sort of thing against the Republicans in places like Illinois and New York and New Jersey, but it would just be horrific if Georgia or Florida, Virginia, or any other southern state slipped from the control of the Democratic Party into the hands of the Populist Party. The Populists have been able to take Midwestern states from the Republican Party, mainly based off of free silver laws for farmers, but they weren't really able to take it from the Democrats because the Democrats relied on their old policy of simply bringing racial amalgamation into the equation to sort of fear, to sort of drive the farmers into this sort of fear-like panic and frenzy to abandon any thoughts of uniting with African Americans. The Redeemer Democrats also amped up the disenfranchisement of African Americans. This is the time in which the poll taxes and the grandfather clauses and all the other Jim Crow voting deprivation laws hit the books. Had the conservative Redeemer Democrats sought to bypass Tom Watson receiving African American and poor white farmers, sharecroppers votes in the South. Um, Yeah, so a lot of political activity going on has the parties sort of respond with panic to what the populists are doing or what they're threatening. Now, the immediate response by the Democratic Party, in addition to just panicking and sweating, was to label Tom Watson as an anarchist and charge him with threatening the womanhood of all Anglo-Saxon women with mongrellism and, of course, Negro supremacy. And this was simply just a rehashing of the Redeemer cries during redemption. Now, violence and intimidation erupted all over the country during this time. There was a very serious effort made by merchants and political elites to quash the Populist Party. In the redeemed states, of course, African American disenfranchisement was completed to head off Watson's actions, but also there was significant legislation and Supreme Court rulings that sort of smacked back any attempt for populist ideas or legislation to gain any sort of traction. Just as the industrial laborers weren't going to receive any relief from the courts, just as African Americans weren't going to receive any relief from the courts, and the populists weren't going to receive any relief from the court. From the courts, the courts would not be willing to assist them in anything. Now, in 1892, the three political parties faced off in the general election. As noted, the Redeemers scrambled to retain control of the redeemed states. The Republican Party scrambled to maintain control of the northeastern and Great Lakes states, and the populists. The populists actually emerged supreme in a number of the mid-western, the prairie states. Has noted they did very well. They carried a couple of states. They carried Kansas, Colorado. As a matter of fact, Colorado was the first to elect a populist governor to their popular governor of their state. North Dakota gave a vote to the populist cause. Their three electoral votes were split between the Republican, the Democratic, and the Populist Party. Quite unique in American history that three political parties received votes from electoral votes from one state. Nevada was also another state that they took, and of course Nevada because of all the silver mines in Nevada. And of course California. California also went populist. Now, when the smoke cleared in 1892, Grover Cleveland emerged as president. He was declared the winner in 1892 over Benjamin Harrison and James Weaver. But the populists had claimed over 1 million votes, and they had claimed 22 electoral votes. Now, a number of federal senators emerged sympathetic to their cause. And they, as I had noted, they also elected 50 congressmen into Senate. So they were slowly building. At this point, we see the national government looking at though it's going to be a three-party system rather than a two-party system. Now, in addition to those federal in addition to federal gains, they also had that they took state offices. They took a number of states legislative positions, and they also took a number of 6 to be total state governorships. Now, a massive depression hit in 1893, and it was one of the worst in the history of the republic. As Grover Cleveland was just coming into office, the nation was hit with this catastrophic, this just catastrophic depression. Over 20% of the workforce of the republic was thrown out of work, and there was no government relief for those in suffering. Those who still had jobs faced deep wage cuts, and these cuts would lead to over 1,000. And the number is closer to 1,500, really, but it would lead to that large amount of strikes the next year in 1894 alone. And many of these fights were so violent that the National Guard and in some cases it's the federal regular army had to be called in to intervene on the business's behalf. Now, the economic problems were so severe that President Grover Cleveland had to turn to major financiers like J.P. Morgan to aid the federal government to sort of mitigate what was happening to the republic. Now, Cleveland's response was, and Cleveland, who was anti-silver, his response was to persuade Congress to rescind the 1890 Silver Act. And this actually just made things even worse because without the silver, less money was going into circulation. It simply made the economic depression that much worse. His actions also lead to an increased popularity for free silver. As more and more people begin to draw this conclusion, in 1873 they took away silver, everybody stopped having any problems. In 1893, if things were bad, they took away silver, things got worse. So more and more people are gravitating towards free silver. Now, at this time, the first ever March on Washington is planned. Before then, nobody had ever really seriously thought of marching on the nation's capital to influence the nation's national or federal leaders. An Ohio man named Jacob Coxey organizes the first March on Washington. His supporters, the entire thing is called Coxey's Army, and Coxey's Army plans to march on Washington to support his plan of government finance works program for the unemployed that would use paper money to pay the participants. And he planned on calling on the government to, one, sponsor federal works program, but then also having them pay the people in money to increase the paper money in circulation, leading to an inflationary economic atmosphere to mitigate the harsh economic environment, the uncompromising economic environment that these men were facing. Now, before he makes it and actually marches on Washington with his followers, Coxey and his admirers, his followers, his army, they're intercepted. Coxey is arrested, and his followers are placed in detention camps. And things just go from bad to worse as 1894 unfolded. Had the Supreme Court declared the income tax that was passed at the federal level unconstitutional. And in 1896, the Silverbugs, or Silverites, actually gained control of one of the national parties. They gained control of the Democratic Party. And they repudiate Grover Cleveland and place free silver along with many other popular talking points into their platform. And this, of course, leads to major intra-party fighting among the Democrats. And that ends with William Jennings Bryan gaining the party's nomination in 1896. Now, at this time, things just collapsed for Grover Cleveland. This led to a major realignment over the monetary policy, with Republicans favoring the gold policy and Democrats favoring free silver. Some politicians switched sides. that this was that important to them. Some switched sides. Some who were formerly Republican went over to the Democrats, and some who were formerly Democrats went over to the Republicans over this issue. And a number of others, namely Grover Cleveland, simply retired from politics. Grover Cleveland had lost control of the party. He had been their nominee for 3 consecutive elections. He won his first election, lost his second, won his third election, and after his second term as president, and again, Grover Cleveland serves as the 22nd and the 24th president of the United States. His terms were non-consecutive. After this, Grover Cleveland goes into retirement. He was beset immediately by an economic depression that never got better. But aside from this, the Populists were put into a major quandary. The aspiring third party were put into a quandary. Has one of the older, more established parties had taken on their most popular issues. And the Populists actually debated joining the Democrats. This would have resulted in the loss of many of their stances and their party identity. They were the party of the workers. They were the party of the farmers. They were and they were the party that had a number of just sort of revolutionary ideas to put forth. The Democrats were not going to go for that. The Democrats were not going to go for a recall or and again, the National Democratic Party of the 19th century, they were not going to go for a recall, an initiative, the direct election of senators, the nationalization of railroads and so forth. Free silver had nearly caused the collapse of the party in itself. Free silver had been enough to collapse the presidency of the sitting president in its party's eyes. So they were not going to further weaken themselves or further divide over this. And this confronted them. This reality. This reality confronted them also with the fact that if they did not fuse or that they did not sort of like join in with the Democrats, then the anti-silver candidate would win, and they would have lost this golden, no pun intended, this golden opportunity, or silver opportunity, I should say. They eventually decided to nominate Bryan as their candidate with Tom Watson as his running mate. Now, this ended with William McKinley winning in an overwhelming majority, 271 to 176 in the Electoral College, and 7 million popular votes to 6.5 million popular votes combined for Bryan. So either way you put it, Jennings had more popular votes than, but McKinley had more popular votes than Bryan. But many people argue that maybe Bryan would have won in the Electoral College. Not really. McKinley won, and that 500,000 shouldn't be taken as 500,000 in our dimes. It should really be seen as an overwhelming majority. Bryan carried only the South, part of the Great Plains and silver mining states. He really didn't come close to McKinley. McKinley swept the Northeast, and again, you have to remember that Bryan took all of the South because the South was a one-party region. Bryan took those populist-leaning states in the Midwest and in the silver camps, but he couldn't come close to those industrial centers. He couldn't come close to those major economic centers, those burgeoning urban economic centers. There was no possibility, no chance of anything like that occurring for him. And of course, McKinley took the Northeast, the Great Lakes, and he did pretty well in those old Granger states as well. Now, these areas were never going to vote for Bryan. That should just be stated. They were not at all interested in deflation. It wasn't that they were careless and didn't care about the farmers, but but inflation would have hurt them. These are workers. Their wages, have we discussed, were not going up. Their wages were being cut. It was hard enough for them to be able to afford to live where they were living. If the farmers' grain prices went up, then they wouldn't have been able to afford to eat. So it would have been just horrific for them. After this election, the Popular Party largely collapsed. Many began to think the Popular Party had the reactionary movement against industrialization and modernization. This idea is reinforced by what happened next. After the election, of course, Tom Watson, the great populist leader, turned racist. He became the most well-known racist in the state of Georgia, surpassing even Alexander Hamilton Stevens' racism. He learned, it is argued, Watson learned from the failed election that the race card was more effective than the class card in post-Reconstruction or Jim Crow era politics. That if he played the race card, he would immediately find a receptive audience, and he would immediately be rewarded with political office, but with their votes and access to political office. That was the findings of Watson. The Populists, it should be noted, also exhibited a very virulent stream of anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, and a really unnerving penchant for promoting conspiracy theories. The crime of 73 notwithstanding. Bryan himself would go on to become a prohibitionist, and later in the 1920s he would emerge during one of the more famous trials in the history of the 20th century, attacking the theory of evolution and the teaching of the theory of evolution in public schools. Now, although the Populist Party melted away before the 20th century, as I stated earlier, a number of their measures lived on and were picked up by the progressive and even the New Dealers. Remember, just to sort of foreshadow what we'll get into during Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, the Works Program, the government hiring civilians, hiring people to go out there and perform works and paying them. Remember, that was one of Coxey's aim. That was Coxey's main aim. A government works program. The government is going to put up these works program and pay people. Well, the major part of the New Deal. That was a populist idea. That was Coxey's idea. That wasn't the only one. Has of course noted direct election of senators, federal income tax. We live with those things today. Populist ideas. If you live in a number of Western states, then recall, initiative, referendum are all on the ballots. One thinks of California Governor Gray Davis being subject to recall in the early 2000s, and the rise of Arnold Schwarzenegger, a former actor, now a reality TV host, who emerged as a politician and swept into office in California. So very much still, very much the legacy. So we very much live with the legacy of the populists in a positive way. The relevancy and importance of the populist lessened, however, over time, and then their legacy is really impacted by this. They were most strongest amongst the farming communities, and had the farming population dwindled, their memory, their contributions sort of faded from memory. Their rhetoric does live on, as their name is used to whenever a call to action is made that addresses the economic plight of the less fortunate, or the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Someone who raises awareness to this is often labeled a populist or a progressive, and we'll get to progressives in a few lectures. But populists and progressives, they really became the sort of like crying designated terms for people who advocated these sort of things, and this is the direct legacy for the original attention of the populists. They really did want to make this change. They really did view the growing inequality as had problematic, and they really did want to make a change. So that's a very apt designation. Now, we still debate who the original populists were, and whether they were radicals bent on overthrowing the existing order, progressive reformers who tried to do what was right, reactionaries resisting the march of time and trying to turn back the clock, or an agrarian special interest group trying to promote their own needs, wants, and desires. For the modern meaning, the term, it denotes the people. And of course, it has very different applications depending on how you feel about the person you are describing. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. Let me know what you thought about the analysis of the populist movement. I'll see you guys next time for another lecture. And as always, I'm Ted.